With that, let me introduce the moderator and pass the microphone to Temina. Temina Akhtar is the Senior Strategic Advisor at UNDP's Regional Bureau for Arab States. She has worked in international development for over 25 years and served in senior management and policy roles in different capacities in various UN organizations. Temina's professional expertise spans economic development, governance, environment, climate change, gender equality, and social inclusion. With that, let me pass the microphone to Temina, who will moderate today's session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serdar, for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all colleagues who are joining from different places. It's my pleasure to moderate this session on conflict and peace building and how decentralization supports these approaches. It is now well acknowledged by peace builders and development practitioners that responsive local governments and inclusive local governance are essential building blocks of peace and reduction of violent conflict in societies. As the primary interface between state and society, the local government remains the natural place to shape recovery of societies that have been deeply divided by violence and conflict, and also for building resilient communities through inclusive governance arrangements that build legitimacy and equity. Inclusive and accountable local governance can help restore social cohesion in divided communities. It can help to facilitate public space and participation in public life, to distribute resources in a way that is transparent and accountable, and also create opportunities equitably for different groups, including safeguarding of minority rights, and blending formal and informal processes of representation and participation. So in the context of national conflicts, decentralization reforms are often a key component of peace agreements that seek to resolve long-standing disputes within states and address also grievances by ensuring a greater say for marginalized groups and ensuring that there is a common working plane for citizens to rebuild their lives that respects and gives voice to all groups. The challenges and the risks that are associated with political decentralization efforts and local governance remain in the aftermath of conflict. This is actually a particularly sensitive time in which it is important to make those governance gains in terms of reducing fragility and also ensuring that a kind of reset towards reduced fragility and greater social cohesion. So we'll be hearing from 3 different countries from the MENA region today. We'll be hearing from Dr. Mahed Hamad Johan. First of all, he is the Deputy Minister in the Republic of Iraq and the Vice Chairman of the Supreme National Committee for Sustainable Development. He holds a PhD in civil engineering from the Baghdad University and specializes in preparing national development plans and strategies, managing projects, formulating and preparing budgets, managing risks and crises. Deputy Minister Johan has previously served as Undersecretary of the Ministry of Finance and a member of the National Security Council and a member of the Economic Affairs Committee in the Council of Ministers. It's really our great pleasure and honor today to have the Deputy Minister join us today to make some remarks regarding the situation in Iraq, specifically as it relates to local governance, conflict reduction, and peace building. So without further ado, I will hand over in a minute the floor to Deputy Minister Johan. I would like to make just a couple of comments regarding logistic issues. So translation will be available. The Deputy Minister will be speaking in Arabic. So please go to the bottom of your screen where you will see the translation icon. You can select Arabic to English or English to Arabic throughout the session today, if you would rather prefer to listen in either language to the Minister. So without further ado now, let me pass the floor to Minister Johan. You have the floor, sir.
شكرا جزيلا سيدتي. أسعد الله مساءكم أو أسعد الله صباحكم على حسب المكان. شكرا جزيلا ليكون أحد المشاركين في تقديم موجز بسيط عن تجربة العراق في موضوع اللامركزية والحكومة المحلية وعلاقتها بالمجتمعات المتأثرة بالنزاع. إذا سأمضي سريعا إذا أذنتم لي جميعا بعرض فكرة بسيطة عن تدرج موضوع اللامركزية في بلدي بعد عام 2003 اللي نعتبروه عام فاصل ما بين نوعين من الحكومات، حكومات يعني غير ديمقراطية وحكومات ديمقراطية. بدءا الدستور العراقي الذي أقر عام 2005 مضى ليشجع ممارسة المسؤولين المحليين للسلطات المحلية وفق مبدأ المشاركة للسكان والمجتمع المدني. وربما أورد الدستور 4 أو 5 مواد أساسية تشير بصورة واضحة إلى هذا الموضوع. المادة 105 مضت لتأسيس هيئة لضمان عدالة وحقوق الأقاليم والمحافظات غير المنتظمة بإقليم. المادة 106 مضت إلى تأسيس هيئة مراقبة تخصيص الواردات الاتحادية وتوزيعها بعدالة. المادة 111 مضت إلى إيجاد سياسات التنمية والتخطيط العام ضمن المدى المحلي وفق الاختصاصات المشتركة. مادة أخرى تتعلق بتقاسم السلطات ضمن الاختصاصات الأساسية التي قد تنشأ فيها نزاعات في مواضيع إدارة الجمارك والطاقة ورسم سياسات البيئة وسياسات التنمية والتخطيط العام والسياسات الصحية والتربوية وكذا إدارة الموارد المائية. بعد هذا وبعد فترة من الزمن أقر قانون خاص بالمحافظات غير المنتظمة بإقليم باعتبار أن الأقاليم تقر بقوانين خاصة، وهذا القانون أشار في مجمله في مواده أقر طبعا قانون رقم 21 لسنة 2008 إلى أدوار التي تلعبها الحكومات المحلية في إعداد الموازنات العامة للمحافظة، في تنفيذ السياسات العامة الموضوعة من قبل الحكومة الاتحادية، في الإشراف على سير المرافق العامة. ثم ذهبت في بنودها إلى تحديد مهمة أساسية تتعلق بالموارد المالية وما يمكن أن يخصص للمحافظات من الموازنة الاتحادية، وعرفت هذه التخصيصات سواء من الموازنة الاتحادية أو من الإيرادات المحلية في 9 بنود أساسية، 8 أو 9 بنود أساسية تتعلق بأجور الخدمات والمشاريع الاستثمارية، الضرائب والرسوم والغرامات المفروضة وفق قوانين الاتحادية والمحلية، التبرعات، إيرادات المنافذ الحدودية، الحصص المتعلقة بالمحافظة التي تنتج أي نوع من أنواع البترو سواء على شكل نفط خام أو على شكل غاز أو على أي منتج من الوقود الأحفوري. مضت مادة أخرى فيه وهي مادة مهمة جدا إلى تأسيس هيئة عليا للتنسيق بين المحافظات يرأسها رئيس الوزراء وعضوية الوزراء المعنيين والمحافظين، تمضي بنقل الدوائر والمهام المحددة في القانون ل8 وزارات لصالح إدارتها إدارة محلية. وتمضي هذه أيضا الهيئة إلى التنسيق بين المحافظات فيما يتعلق بشؤونها المحلية ووضع آليات لإدارة الاختصاصات المشتركة بينها وبين الحكومة الاتحادية. لن أمضي، هنالك تعديل تم في القانون عام 2018، وهنا أركز على السيد الدكتور اللي قدم الورشة حول الخصوصية التي تتعلق بكل دولة في اللامركزية وفهم اللامركزية. تم تعديل هذا القانون بحقيقة ربما كان عودة بسيطة إلى بعض الاختصاصات، محاولة لإعادتها إلى السلطة المركزية. أمضي سريعا إلى ما حاولنا أن نفكر فيه في وزارتنا وعلى أكثر من خيار، ليس فقط في وزارة التخطيط next please، بل على مستوى الهيئات المعنية بالتنسيق دعم اللامركزية. أقرت الحكومة عام 2018 ضمن خطتها الوطنية الخمسية، والتي وضعتها بالتنسيق مع البرنامج الإنمائي يعني وبدعم من البرنامج الإنمائي المتحدة، إلى تحديد الأولويات التنموية المترتبة على وفق الأوضاع التي مرت بها المحافظات، حيث حددنا جزء مهم من هذه الخطة ليمثل خطط المحافظات التي بنتها بنفسها، ومضينا إلى تقسيم المحافظات في جزئين أساسيين على وفق الظرف الذي كان يعيشه البلد في ذلك الوقت. الموضوع المهام الأساسية اللي حاولنا نستكملها بعد 2018 كوزارة وكجميع مؤسسات معنية باللامركزية في العراق هو استكمال عملية نقل الصلاحيات وتوفير الدعم للمؤسسات والمالي للهياكل التنظيمية المحلية، تفعيل دور المجالس التخطيط التنموية المحلية، تنفيذ المشاريع ذات النفع العام والتي تشترك أكثر محافظة في تقديمها، توفير الإطار القانوني لتعظيم وتنويع الإيرادات. لدينا شراكة كبيرة مع برنامج الأمم المتحدة لتطوير قدرات هذه الإدارات في بناء خططها الوطنية على مراحل. مضينا بهذا الموضوع مع UNDP والUNHabitat وصولا إلى بناء قدرات جيدة وخطط محلية ناضجة، وكذا مضينا مع UNHabitat لإيجاد ما يسمى بالهياكل الحضرية. لاحقا وحاليا نعمل على شبه منتدى مشترك لكل الدعم الدولي والمحلي الذي يضمن الاستمرار في موضوع اللامركزية والإدارة اللامركزية. أمضي سريعا إلى برامج تطوير الإدارة اللامركزية. في آخر خطة أعدت في دعم اللامركزية والحكم المحلي وثرى على السلام في المحافظات، كانت أعددنا الوثيقة التي حقيقة كانت مهمة جدا، تتعلق بصنفين من المشاكل على مستوى السلام على مستوى المحافظات. واحد من هذه المشاكل تتعلق بالمحافظات التي تعرضت للإرهاب أو عاشت مجتمعاتها الإرهاب، وهنا نتكلم عن تغيير الهوية الاقتصادية لهذه المحافظات، عن مشكلة النازحين. Please next is not this slide, the next slide or the other. مشكلة النازحين والمهجرين، انهيار البنى التحتية للمشاريع الأساسية في هذه المحافظات، ومشكلات الانفلات المجتمعي والصراعات العشائرية نتيجة التدهور الأمني، إضافة إلى مشاكل أخرى تتعلق بتدهور الإنتاج بكل مسمياته وارتفاع معدلات البطالة ومستوى الفقر. على المستوى المحافظات التي لم تكن معرضة بصورة مباشرة للإرهاب، فكانت هنالك مشكلة كبيرة واضحة واتضحت في السنوات الأخيرة تتعلق بعدم انسياق الصلاحيات الإدارية والمالية لهذه الإدارات بما يحدد من قدرتها على اتخاذ القرارات، نقص في التشريعات ذات الصلة بتنظيم الإطار الاقتصادي والنشاط الاقتصادي، وتردي في بيئة الاستثمار. لكل من هذه الحالتين ظهرت مشاكل كبيرة. على مستوى المحافظات الشمالية موضوع كبير في الموضوع معالجة الحرب والعودة إلى مرحلة السلام، وعلى مستوى المحافظات الجنوبية كان لدينا مشكلة كبيرة أخرى في البطالة، في عدم اندماج الحكومات المحلية في سياق واضح لتقديم خدمات أفضل للمواطنين بسبب شحة الموارد المالية وأسباب أخرى. لذلك هذين النموذجين أوجدت لنا الحالة الأفضل فيما بعد 2018 و19 بعد مظاهرات كبيرة على مستوى العراق حتى غيرت حكومة كاملة. مضينا إلى دعم أكبر حقيقة لموضوع اللامركزية، وهذا الدعم يتمثل بنموذج في المحافظات المحررة، بنموذج نجاح كبير جدا بقدرة الحكومات المحلية على الاندماج مع المجتمع الدولي والحكومة الاتحادية في الوصول إلى المواطنين وتقديم أفضل الخدمات أو العودة بمستوى الخدمات. وعلى مستوى لاحقا في المحافظات الجنوبية باستيعابهم لأزمة الشباب والمظاهرات في أكثر من محافظة. واليوم حقيقة هذا الدعم للامركزية وللحكومات المحلية أوجد حالة من الاستقرار النسبية وعودة الاطمئنان والسلام إلى المجتمعات. أنا أعتقد قد أكون تجاوزت الوقت، ولكن التجربة أثبتت لي شخصيا على مستوى نوعين من أنواع النزاع مع قوى الإرهاب والنزاع الداخلي على مستوى الشباب، والرضا عن الحكومات الاتحادية والمحلية. أوضحت لي التجربة أنه دعم الحكومات المحلية كان أفضل طريقة للوصول إلى تخفيف حدة النزاع والسلام والاطمئنان لجميع المواطنين. شكرا جزيلا لمنحي هذه الفرصة، واعتذر عن قد أكون أطلت عن الفترة الأساسية المخصصة لي بالحديث.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Deputy Minister Johan, for that presentation. I think we are privileged to hear the experience that you are presenting from Iraq and all the challenges that have been tackled. I will revert to you, Deputy Minister, later on with a follow-up question. I understand that you will be able to stay with us for about 50 minutes. So thank you very much. Let me now turn to the second country that we will be hearing from, and that is Somalia. So I'd like to first of all introduce Frida Karimi, who manages the UNDP Joint Program on Local Governance in Somalia. She has over 20 years of private sector and UN experience working in the areas of governance, specifically local governance and area-based approaches, and program management in Kenya, in Sudan, and in Somalia. She holds a master's in business administration, operations and strategic management, and various certificates in the fields of decentralization, governance, risk management, and gender, among others. So Frida, I would like to basically ask you the first question to describe a little bit the context of Somalia. How and why have local governance approaches emerged to address the conflict and fragility challenges that are experienced? And what specific patterns of local governance have emerged from the fragility? So let me pass the floor to you, Frida. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Semina. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. And I'm sorry, I'd have to switch off my video because my system is not very stable. Apologies for that. So I'll go right into it and give a short history of Somalia. Somalia is a federal government with 6 states, and the capital city, which is called Mogadishu, the status is still undetermined. So for the purposes of this webinar, we are going to treat it as a state. Now, the 4 new federal member states are the ones that were formed after the provisional constitution in 2010, while Somaliland and Puntland have been in existence for quite a long time, with Somaliland being more or less autonomous, but represented in the federal government. For purposes of this webinar, again, we're going to concentrate more on the federal member states because Somaliland and Puntland are more or less established, having had a political settlement in the 90s amongst the clans, which caused them to have a more or less stable social and political environment for JPLG to come into play. For the new federal member states, their political settlement came a bit late, and it was around the 2010 when a sufficient number of political actors were able to come together for a temporary halt of open conflict. And they agreed on a provisional constitution, which is currently being reviewed, and it is highly contested. And this contestation has left a lot of the Somali state and the relationship between the institutions in a state of suspension. Now, this has led to a very fractured institutional landscape. In most failed states, the fractured institutional landscape comes before the political settlement. But in Somalia, you find that the political settlement came first, then the institutional landscape became fractured because of the contestations on the constitution. Most of the new federal member states, which are 4, they are more or less city states because what is controlled by the government is mainly the capital cities. And we have 3 areas of differentiation. So we have the areas that are newly recovered and they're under control of government. Then we have areas that have not yet been recovered, which are under control of Al-Shabaab. And then even the areas where Al-Shabaab does not control and they still don't claim any legitimate authority over them, sometimes they are not reachable and they're not governed by government because of the proximity to the Al-Shabaab areas. Then we have the other areas which are sort of clan and militia controlled, and they try to negotiate with the government without being part of the government. Now, in this situation, we'll find that there's a lot of, in the federal member state, there's no physical, human, and social infrastructure. So a lot of the institutions have to sort of be reinvented and reconstructed. And also within that structure, not all the states are homogeneous, and the districts within the states are also not homogeneous. So we have to have different approaches to the different states, and that is how now we come into the local governance approaches. Now, because Somalia is very clan-based, they have the 4.5 system where the 4 major clans form the 4 and the rest of the clans form the 0.5. This is what is normally used as a basis for allocation of positions and resources. You'll find that specific states have more of one clan than the other one. So it was much easier for them to come together as the state, to form a state, because they are more or less the same people. They also have a federal government, which has been able, which means different levels of government, and that's how decentralization has been able to come into that space to address the needs of each of the states separately. Now, some of the things that JPLG, which is a joint program on local governance and decentralized service delivery, has been able to leverage on is that different tiers of government, where when we go to the local level, we don't get involved in the politics of the federal government too much, and we are able to do a lot with the local government. For example, when it comes to the decentralization policies, the constitution is clear that the states will run their own decentralization policies and they can decide which services to devolve. So this is not totally under the control of the federal government. So we are able to go and have decentralization policies at the local level. The other thing that has emerged is the area-based approach, which enables us to be able to work in specific districts, the ones that have district councils. Now, one of the shortcomings of the program is that because we only work in districts that have district councils or some semi-legitimate government authority, we leave a lot of the other areas outside because they are run by Al-Shabaab. So the area-based approach is working very well because we can go to the various districts that have district councils and be able to support them. The other thing that we normally do, and what has brought local governance at the forefront of peace and conflict management, is having contextualized policies. So we look at each state individually and tailor the policies and the capacity building programs to that particular state. The other way we've been able to come up with this is having the peer-to-peer learning, where we have different states visit each other and see what is working. And these will come into play when we can't access the areas, but the Somalis can access those areas. So they visit each other and are able to support each other technically. Then we have what is called the light touch approach for the areas that would not have district councils. And this came about because the governments that saw what was happening in the other districts and the levels of intervention requested that we do district council formation so they can also be able to benefit from the program. But it became a very contentious and political issue. So we were not able to do any district councils, but we agreed with them that we're going to have something called a light touch approach, where if they do not have district councils, but they have a sort of legitimate form of government, we will go in and do a bit of training, or provide a few furniture and equipment for them to be able to operate. This has worked very well in those districts, but the problem now becomes that the government tries to capture them because they're already happening. They can be able to build on them without ever having to form district councils and forming that legitimacy. and being able to have that social contract where people can hold the government accountable. The other thing now is the challenge we normally have in this is that when it comes to things like revenue assignments, we have a very hard time because you're not very sure who you're giving the money to when you don't have a legitimate government. So all these come into play when you have to negotiate with very many actors. The other thing is when it comes to the federal government, sometimes they do have a lot of say in some of the states, which causes more conflict because when you're trying to do something at the state level, and one of the states is not working with you, they destabilize the rest of the states. And we try to address that through a lot of dialogue and trying to show them what are the benefits of having a program like JPLG. The other thing is for the infrastructure and the physical and human and social capital, we try a lot to capacitate the people on the ground, but as I've said, most of these institutions were largely non-existent. So we will work with what is there, but sometimes you just walk into a ministry and find it's only the minister and the DG and the rest of the people are sort of volunteers. So it becomes very hard to have a capacity building program. So sometimes we will have capacity injection through local consultants and young graduates from the universities, so they can be able to have a pool of civil servants. Then the other thing is inclusion and trying to work a lot with the community monitoring groups, which form the basis of the planning process that the JPLG does. And these work very well for the area-based approach because you have local people, they know the local terrain, they know what works for them, they know what their needs are, and they're able to hold their governments accountable for that. The flip side is that most of these community monitoring groups have women because they're not paid positions, but they are actually working very well because they're able to come back to the mayor and say, this is what we had planned and you did not do it, why did you not do it? On these, again, we are able to have what we call the community scorecards, which are specific to each of the areas. And it's still an accountability mechanism and a way for the citizens to participate in the running of their councils. What this has also been able to bring about peace because they have to work with people from different clans and people from different villages and different ministries. We also have the last mile problem in Somalia, where we are trying to reach the people who really need help the most, but sometimes you're not able to do that because of that, again, not having the district councils, which has become quite a hindrance. But this is being addressed through having what I've called the peer-to-peer learning, where we are able to send local staff and consultants from the other states to be able to support the states that do not have the systems in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frida, for your remarks. Very interesting observations. There are a lot of issues there regarding inclusion, regarding involvement of community groups, and also the different contexts and the need for contextualized policies. I will be turning back to you with the second question later in the session. But for now, let me turn to the third country that we are focusing on today in today's webinar, which is Libya. Where also the peace and conflict context is unique and different. I have great pleasure to introduce to you Larissa Rippel, the advisor for peace building and donor coordination in the GIZ Libya portfolio. Her focus lies on peace, security, and governance in fragile contexts. Previously, she worked with the GIZ African Union portfolio on supporting the African peace and security architecture. Larissa has an MA in international relations and specializes in institutional response to fragility and crisis. Larissa, you have the floor, and I will just pose to you the first question. What is the current situation regarding decentralization and local governance reforms in Libya? And also, under these conditions, what is GI's approach to support the decentralization and local governance process in Libya? Over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, and thanks for having me today. So let me start with the first question. So the question being, what is the current situation regarding the decentralization and local governance reform in Libya? It's a rather broad question, but I'll just have a quick look over the historical development. and then also the current status of the decentralization process. So traditionally, Libya is a very diverse country with very autonomous regions. So we have Tripolitania, which is in the northwest, we have Cyrenaica, which is in the northeast, and we have Fezzan, which is in the south. These regions are traditionally coined by diverging social and governance structures, which are usually very autonomous, but they're also coined by their own culture and geographic setting. However, under Gaddafi, as many of you will know, Libya turned into a highly centralized state. So it's often referred to as not so much a one-party state, but really more of a one-person state. Gaddafi more or less abolished local divisions in which traditionally tribal leaders held greatest powers. And instead, there was a system of appointment of local representatives, but they were appointed nationally and often from within the military. So following the revolution of 2011 and the context of the Arab Spring, there was broad consensus that there is a more decentralized approach necessary. And we're of course not talking about federalism, but rather the need to bring solutions closer to where the problems occur and really to bring governance closer to its constituents. After all, Libya remains a diverse country in which many different realities are being lived at the same time, and the governance system should reflect it. So as a consequence of this development, 99 municipalities were established in Libya. And in 2012, Law 59 was passed, and it's the law that focuses on decentralization, reform, and local governments administration systems. This law stipulates that a municipality comprises an elected mayor and a council, and that the municipality is responsible for the direct provision of services to its citizens. This means that enforcing municipal regulations, establishing and managing public utilities, and developing local investments. However, Law 59, as it currently stands, is just a framework that requires more work on detailing which functions need to be covered by whom. Municipalities currently have no source of their own revenue, so there's no, for example, taxing system at a local level. There's a high dependence on transfers from the central government. So just to summarize for your first question, the current status of decentralization is that there is a legal framework and a broad consensus that decentralization is necessary. However, a local governance system is in place, but as long as responsibilities and financing are not really clarified, it's still very much a system in the making. So now your second question was asking under what conditions, or under these conditions, how does GSZ work on this? So GSZ has been working in Libya since 2016 and has initially started with a decentralization and local governance project. Now we have further projects that also address different issues, but from the decentralization point of view, it's been ongoing support since 2016. So this is focusing on peace building, local governance, and decentralization across Libya. The decentralization project covers 25 municipalities in the west, the south, and more recently also the east of the country. This is only 1/4 of all municipalities, roughly, as we've mentioned before, but due to largely varying population sizes, the municipalities that we work with cover approximately 50% of the Libyan population. In general, the municipalities are a good representation of the diverse nature of Libya. For example, some of the municipalities have decades of experience providing certain services to its constituents, whereas other municipalities are very new and have only been established with regards to the decentralization reform following the 2011 revolution. Equally, they have very diverging experiences among the municipalities with regards to their to the most recent conflicts. So many of the municipalities that we work with have been on the front line of violent clashes and have been between conflicting forces. Others have been less affected or more indirectly affected by the conflicts, such as through restrictions on movement and scarcity of commodities. Now, GSZ addresses the support to decentralization reform through a classic multi-level and cross-regional approach. Specifically, so I've already mentioned that we are now working in all 3 regions of Libya. But for the level approach, we work on the national, the municipal, and the social level. So at the national level, we cooperate very closely with relevant ministries, and here, most importantly, the Ministry of Local Governance. GSZ supports the decentralization reform and the capacity development, and this is really the step necessary to bring Law 59, so the law on local administration, from theory to practice, by strengthening planning and implementation capacities for decentralization reform, but also by strengthening employees of the MOLG, so the Ministry of Local Governments, in exercising the roles and supporting in drafting of policies and other regulatory frameworks. Furthermore, and still on the national level, GSZ supports the improvement of the national dialogue, the coordination and the communication. So being a very large country and a very diverse country, this is necessary to overcome the internal divides, to work on a joint strategy that is owned by all key actors. Because as I mentioned, there's broad consensus that there's a need for decentralization, but very different interpretations of how this decentralization process can look like. On the municipal side, GSZ supports the capacity development at local level for partner municipalities to ensure municipalities have the organizational structures and necessary skills to fulfill the mandate and to lead the municipal planning process. At the same time, GSZ supports the capacity development for municipalities to finance basic public services to ensure they have the financial means to fulfill their mandates. Now, at the social level, GSZ supports the capacity development for civil society actors to improve inclusion, to strengthen participation, and to ensure society takes an active role in developing the new decentralized Libya. So to summarize, the three-level approach is chosen as a comprehensive approach to address decentralization and local governance reform in Libya. It addresses the three levels that I mentioned, so the national, the municipal, and the social level of the country, and by this seeks to establish an inclusive and representative system, which can thus contribute to social cohesion and mutual understanding in Libya.
Thank you very much, Larissa. Thank you for those very interesting reflections on the context in Libya and the different aspects of the law on decentralization and local governance that was passed, what the experience has been, and also the engagement with the three different levels and the bearing that this has on outcomes for social cohesion. So I would like to now announce that audience members are very welcome to pose questions to specific panelists or to all panelists. Please feel free to pose them in the chat. Susanna, our colleague from GIZ, will be monitoring the chat, and I will ask her in a second to maybe find some of the key questions that we will be able to take. Probably we will have time for around a couple of questions. But before we do that and go to the Q&A, I'd like to go to a second round of questions with the panelists, given that the Deputy Minister is here just for a little longer with us, and then also follow-up questions to the two panelists, and then we'll go back to the questions that you're posing in the chat. So my question to the Minister, Minister Johan.
نعم أنا معكم أستمع سيدتي.
Thank you very much. So, thank you very much. So in terms of the future directions for Iraq in decentralization and local governance, what do you see as the challenges and also the opportunities to really strengthen this process? Did you catch that? Perhaps the translator could translate.
تسمحي لي بالإجابة سيدتي؟
Yes.
شكرا جزيلا على هذا السؤال. الحقيقة يهمني أن أركز على أنه إحنا بالنسبة لنا مفهومنا للامركزية هو ليس بالمفهوم السياسي البحت بالمطلق، بل هو حقيقة مفهوم خدمي على الأقل بالنسبة لي كوزارة معنية بالتخطيط للمستقبل هو الوصول بأفضل خدمة للمواطنين. على التحديات المستقبلية حقيقة صار تذبذب في مسيرة أو التقدم في مسيرة اللامركزية على المستوى السياسي والمستوى التنفيذي. آخر تعديل ربما لقانون المحافظات أربك مسيرة اللامركزية يعني على الأقل من ناحية الجماهير. أنا أفهم جدا وكل أصحاب الخبرة يفهمون أن التطور بمراحل التقدم في موضوع اللامركزية تحتاج إلى وقت طويل وتمر بحالات قوة وضعف، ولذلك هذا التحدي لما البرلمان آخر تعديل إلى ربما يعني كان غير مرغوب به بإعادة بعض الخدمات من السلطات المحلية إلى السلطات المركزية نتيجة ظروف طرأت في وقت الحرب مع الإرهاب داعش وكذلك الظروف السياسية الأخيرة. ولكن من المهم هنا التركيز على الناحية الإيجابية. طبعا من التحديات الأخرى التي تواجهنا أنه هذه الحكومات يعني التغير في القدرات أو الملاكات الإدارية والمالية التي ندعم تطويرها مع البرامج الأمم المتحدة مع باقي الوزارات ونوصلها إلى خبرات جيدة جدا. حالما تتغير إدارات العليا في الحكومات المحلية تغير هذه الشخوص المهمة في إدارة وتخطيط منهجية المحافظة، وهذا مثبت، وسنحاول أن نمضي إلى وضع معايير شديدة لتغيير القيادات ما دون مستوى رئيس الحكومة المحلية. على الناحية الإيجابية التجربة اللي نعيشها حقيقة في الثلاث سنوات الأخيرة بدأت تعطي ثمارها بصورة واضحة جدا لمفهوم أنه اللامركزية مفهوم وصول إلى الحاجات المواطنين، إلى التشاركية في بناء الأولويات وبناء القرارات. أعتقد اليوم أغلب المحافظات في العراق بدأت تتنافس بجدية لتقديم أفضل الخدمات، في حين كان التنافس قبل 2 أو 3 سنوات على موضوع الصلاحيات والسلطات. اليوم في تنافس كبير وواضح على مستوى تقديم الخدمات باتخاذ نموذج القدوات ببرامجنا التي توائم مع الحكومات المحلية الخارجية. الشيء الثاني المهم أيضا هو أنه بدأت تعمل الهيئات المتخصصة في ضمان التوزيع العادل للإيرادات. محافظات البلد تختلف في قدراتها المالية والبشرية على ما تحتويه من النفط، وحتى على قدراتها في قطاعات الزراعة والصناعة، ولذلك عدالة التوزيع مهمة جدا لضمان السلام على المستوى المحلي. أخيرا وليس آخرا، حقيقة هنالك وعي كبير على مستوى أداء منظمات المجتمع المدني والمجتمعات المدنية، إضافة إلى وعي كبير للشباب في الاندماج، طبعا بالشباب بمسماه يعني الجندري، النساء، بنشاط أكبر حقيقة وحرص أكبر بالاندماج يعني في بناء صورة أفضل لأفضل الممارسات على مستوى الإدارة المحلية. أعتقد هذا النموذج بغض النظر عن التطورات السياسية اللي أشرت لها بالبداية وسلبيتها يعني على المنظور العام، ولكن التغيرات الإيجابية قد تعكس المسار، وأكيد ستعكس المسار في المضي بهذا الموضوع للمستقبل. شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much, Minister Johan, for those remarks and for sharing your candid views. I think you've touched upon really interesting elements here for the future, including that positive competition between the different states to support people and to really serve the people. I think tremendously important to have that element and that trajectory. You also talked about fair distribution of revenues. I think this goes to the heart heart of perceptions of accountability and transparency in governance, and also to social cohesion and integration of the different groups and different states in Iraq. I think that will also be a critical element, as you mentioned. And also a really important point that you raised, which I was thinking about as I heard the first set of responses, was really the engagement of women and youth and others that you've pointed out. How do we ensure that there is a greater participation in governance, and how do local governments really ensure that? So thank you so much. I really appreciate your remarks, and I wish you and the future peace building process for Iraq to be successful. As we have seen in other countries in different regions, there is always that element of risk of falling back on hard-won gains in terms of reestablishing the social contract and getting countries back on track after conflict. So we wish you and Iraq all the best. Let me now turn to Frida and back to Somalia.
شكرا جزيلا سيدتي، وقد يعني أعتذر بعد 5 دقائق سوف
Okay, thank you very much.
يعني على الأقل لا أستطيع التواصل.
Thank you very much for your time today and for joining us. It was a really pleasure to hear from you. So I would now like to turn to Frida and back to Somalia. Frida, what are the potential challenges to implementing local governance interventions for peace building that you see? And how do you overcome those challenges? What are some of the lessons learned?
Thank you, Tamina. And I'll try and answer the challenges and what we have done together. And then the lessons learned will come after. So the major challenges are security, accessibility, political interference, and lack of enough data. For security now, sometimes you find, as I was talking about, the way the states have the various districts being under Al-Shabaab control. The government has control of one district, then they have control of another district in another area. So they can't even use cars to access the place because the rest of the areas are controlled by Al-Shabaab. So that's one of the problems that we normally have, including both for the government and for the UN agencies. That also limits accessibility, mostly because of Al-Shabaab, the transport sector not being very well developed or having flights that sometimes the UN cannot use. And even the government sometimes have to use UN flights, which are not very frequent in those areas, again, because of security. The other challenge is data. We don't normally have enough data, for example, when it comes to revenue allocation, and we have to do projects, allocate money based on the population. When we don't have the actual population of each of the districts, you might end up giving more money to a district that has less people based on official data. And these official data might have been manipulated or it's not up to date. And then you cause conflict because then the other districts, because they can see what their locations are, would question why a certain district that has less people is being given. The other one is political interference, and this comes a lot from the federal government, where you'll find a state like, let's say one of the federal member states is more aligned to the federal government, and then they will try and scuttle the activities that are happening in the other federal member states because they're not listening to the federal government. So a lot of the work becomes hindered in that space. Now, how we address this, one of them is having third-party monitoring for the areas that are not very accessible, having local staff there, and also having consultants from the established states, especially Somaliland and Puntland, going to the federal member states to help them technically. The other one we have is having a joint program and having a multi-sectoral approach helps because each of the technical agencies comes with their own expertise. For example, the joint program on local governance is implemented by 5 agencies, which is ILO, UNCDF, UNDP, UN Habitat, and UNICEF. Each of these comes with their own technical expertise, and we are able to cover more areas opposed to if it was only UNDP and its mandate covering it. So that's one of the other ways of addressing some of these challenges. And having a multi-sectoral approach where we'll deal with the Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Public Works, and many of the other social sector ministries helps us also reach more people, especially at the district level. And also sometimes we do have competitions among the districts where we will give an award for the district that is best performing. And that competition helps them to be able to perform better the next time because they want to get the award. The other one is another challenge is having divided cities. For example, we have Galkayo, which has a north and a south. So we work in North Galkayo, but you don't work in South Galkayo because South Galkayo does not have a district council. How we have addressed this is that we have been able to link up the north and the south, but staying a bit under the radar of the federal government in terms of politicizing the relationship, because the minute it gets to the political space, then it's politicized and everything goes awry. But when they deal on the level of states, they are able to help each other on technical support and exchanging of ideas. The other challenge we have is JPLG is very formalized, and this is understandable because we have multi-donors and we have multi-agencies. So we need to have work plans that are not very, very flexible so that we can be able to achieve our mandate. Now, a lot of the work that happens with JPLG is with formal organizations like the ministries and the districts. There's a lot of informal work that goes on, especially with the clan leaders and the traditional elders who are extremely powerful when it comes to things like election and selecting the women who are going to be elected. Now, when we're not able to get into that informal space, a lot of people are left out. So we need to find a way of how to engage in that space. And these, we've tried a lot dealing with the stabilization actors who are able to have more of these dialogues with the different people and link up with them so that once they get the peace dividends out of it, then JPLG can be able to come in. The other challenge is sometimes we have areas where the district governments under heavy control of the federal government, they disband the councils because they are more or less selected, and then JPLG has to stop the work. So how we address it is we tell them that we're not going to work with them anymore. We're not going to have any investments there until they have a district council form. So this is sort of works as a catalyst because it's a pre-established condition for engagement of the JPLG. The other thing is that there's a lot of government ownership, especially the projects, because they become very visible to what the politicians are doing. And that ownership has helped the program be able to grow and be able to expand to other areas. And in places like Somaliland, the government has been able to have a government-led expansion program where for the districts we cannot go to, the government uses the systems that we have established in the more mature districts to be able to go to the newer districts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frida. Those were really very interesting observations from the ground, very granular, very specific to the context, and really, important to reflect on. Let's hear from Larissa now. So, Larissa, if you're available, I'd like to turn to you with the second question. What are some of the good examples that prove the power of decentralization and local governance for peace building that you could share with us from Libya's example? Any lessons learned in this process, and also priorities for the future and the way forward that you might want to highlight? Over to you, Larissa.
Thank you very much, Jamina. Yes, so I think there's a lot of, there's a close relationship between local governance and peace building, but I'll just highlight a few aspects today. There's two main factors that I want to look at when it comes to the power of decentralization and local governments for peace building. Firstly, citizens need to regain trust in government. Especially in conflict countries in general, this is often not the case. So there's very little trust in government. As a government or predecessor system was involved in a conflict, or possibly because there's never been much trust in a government to begin with. So this is especially true for local governance systems because oftentimes they didn't exist before. So it is difficult to trust something that you're unfamiliar with. Secondly, government and the governance system need to act in a representative manner to ensure a more peaceful society. A governance system needs to be as diverse as the society that it represents. And local governance, again, for me, is key to that, because I think it allows for representation across a diverse country, which is also particularly true in the case of Libya. So these two factors, the trust by the people in the government and the representation of the people by the government, is really a two-way relationship. The reason why this is particularly interesting, I think, for local governments is because the MENA or municipal governance structure is the closest to its constituents and does the necessary connection to actually strengthen this reciprocal relationship. So in the specific case of Libya, an inclusive and accountable local governance system can help restore social cohesion in Libya's divided communities, facilitate participation in public life, and also distribute resources and opportunities equitably. Now, what are the difficulties that we are facing in Libya? So in 2019, GSZ conducted a municipal level peace and conflict assessment. It was done in cooperation with New York University and the Libyan-based Mumkin organization. And one of the results of the assessment that I think is particularly interesting in light of your question is that the majority of the assessments noted that weak municipal leadership is a key driver of conflict. There are really a lot of factors that are relevant for this judgment, and often it also goes to the actual service provision, so not just the leadership itself, but also the service municipalities is providing. But I really want to look more at the leadership and the trust in leadership. This is also very close to the two-way connection that I was talking about before. I believe that what we got out of this analysis is that our participants specifically expressed mistrust in the municipal leadership, and I think this is a sign of an incomplete decentralization reform. So there's two indicators that I think hint to this. The first one is that participants mentioned the greater relative trust in or strength of tribal leaders. And this to me is a sign that tribal leadership is likely closer to the citizens, still more representative, but also that the local government system maybe didn't do enough to adequately integrate traditional governance structures in its system. A second point that was mentioned is that that we've considered very interesting is that we receive very diverging levels of trust in governance structures from urban to rural regions. So in our analysis, leadership is perceived to be much weaker in rural municipalities than in urban municipalities. Residents of municipalities farthest from Tripoli, for example, appear to be least content with the leadership, whereas municipalities in Tripoli itself all assessed that they perceive the leadership as effective and powerful. And so this divergence really shows that there's two conclusions that we can draw from this. I think that we have an incomplete decentralization process, which subsequently affects the peaceful development of the country. And so the first conclusion is the mayors who are physically closer to the seat of the national government may enjoy more direct exchanges and leverage when representing their constituents' interests at the national level. So in an ideally decentralized system, all municipalities should, however, have the same status. Another conclusion that can be drawn from this, and it's just assumptions really, is that municipalities in Tripoli are also more likely to be more familiar with municipal affairs, as Tripoli previously, also under the Gaddafi regime, had more responsibilities in this regard, and there's more civil servants in Tripoli than in some of the new municipalities. But again, this is only, it's a logical and normal finding, but it's also, so it's logical for a transition period, but it's still a sign that there is an incomplete decentralization process. So to summarize I think local governance can have a very strong effect on peace building. And it's really the two-way relationship that I've mentioned. So we need to work on creating further trust in governance systems, but also make sure that the governance system is representative of its constituents. Now to go to the lessons learned and what this means to peace building and for our actions, particularly in GSZ Libya. So we're focusing on these two issues, and we're focusing on the multi-level approach that I've mentioned. And in order to ensure increasing trust by citizens in this governance system, we really also need to do this at all levels. So at the national level, we need to ensure that municipalities are given the means to fulfill their mandate, as well as a clear framework that helps them understand what is covered by the mandate. Secondly, at the municipal level, we need to strengthen the functioning of the municipality and allow them to better fulfill their mandate through capacity building and institutional development. But thirdly, and very importantly, also at the societal level, we need to ensure there is a participatory process in place that shows constituents how government processes function. And by strengthening civil society organizations, we can also further bridge this gap between society and governance and government institutions. But also when looking at the second direction, so not just looking at how we can build trust in government systems, is how we can make sure that they're representative. And here it's maybe more important to look at it from the bottom-up approach. So the societal level, we really need to make sure there is civil society organizations that also give voices to more marginalized groups. We need to make sure that civil society is strong, but it's not just on an institutional level, but just individual voices are being heard. At a local level, it is, at the municipal level, it is really important that we keep inclusive approaches when we're working on local level implementation of the governance system. So by ensuring a representative structure within the municipality, but also by ensuring participatory process, we can really integrate different viewpoints. And at the national level, it is important to think that we're not only looking at municipalities or interacting with municipalities by giving orders, but also they are the key to getting information from the regions and creating a more inclusive approach that considers maybe viewpoints or experiences that are difficult to understand from the more central and national level.
Thank you very much, Larissa. I think really important takeaways there. You know, the trust building and the representation aspects are really central to what we're doing. And I think that's important to bear in mind. I think what you've said is also echoed by the other panelists. And also the aspects that you point out are essential for building forward, the means to implement the mandate being there, the strengthening of the functioning of local governments and the participatory process, I think also very key elements of the direction forward. I think we've heard that also from the Iraqi minister, also coming in some points raised by Frida. So I think without further ado then, I would like to open the floor now for us to take the questions. Susanna from GIZ will be reading to us perhaps 3 key questions from the chat. That should be fairly diverse, Susanna. Let's then turn back to the panelists for responses to your questions, trying to make this more interactive and also, you know, listening, having an opportunity to hear more from our panelists. So over to you, Susanna.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you, Tamina. I've been collecting questions and it seems to me that our participants are fairly interested in the question of participation. So I have the first question directly to Frida, one question for Larissa, and then a general question for both. So the question to Frida would be, well, first of all, it's very interesting in the case of Somalia. Could you please elaborate a bit further who is organizing the community-based monitoring, who is doing it, and how is the dialogue with the local government authorities structured?
Thank you very much, and that's an interesting question. Now, the Joint Program on Local Governance supports planning right from the community level. So one of the agencies, which is UNICEF, comes in at the civic education level. And what we normally emphasize is the soft elements of local governance. These are mostly social reconciliation so as to be able to build a social contract between the citizens and the state, good governance approaches, and civic participation. We go down to the village level and have civic education on the roles and responsibilities of the various levels of government, including citizens. then we have each of the villages select someone to represent them at the district level. So if it's a cluster of 10 villages, for example, we have 10 members of the community monitoring group. And what they do is they're the ones who take the requests of the rest of they gather the needs of the rest of the community and are able to present them at the district level when they're doing the annual work plans for each of the years. Now, what has been interesting is that most of the community monitoring groups, and again, I think I mentioned this because they are not paid positions, you'll find most of them are women. But the positive side of this is that the women also become very vocal and they feel very empowered by their communities to be able to then follow up on whether the projects that they have selected have been implemented or not. The local governments have also now been very receptive to this because they've realized that they are being held accountable. And some of them are even publishing their plans for the year and having regular meetings with the communities to be able to have a dialogue with them in terms of what had I said I will deliver, have I delivered, and why haven't I delivered? And they even use this as a campaign tool. For example, in Somaliland, the president was actually asked, what are you going to do when you come into power about the program called JPLG? Because it has a lot of government ownership. And part of it is that the community has been very vocal about what the program does. Again, on the community monitoring groups, they hold the governments accountable, especially on service delivery. They are able to call in, for example, if we make a water bucket, it's a huge water tank, and maybe the pipes are clogged or they're not working, the women are able to spot it very quickly, or the members of the community monitoring group, and bring it to the attention of the local authorities. And because the local authorities know that they will be called out, especially on social media, then the feedback loop works, that they will be able to address that case very quickly. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Frida. Thank you very much. Susanna, would you like to pose the next question?
Sure. Actually, building now on what we just heard from Frida, one of the participants was interested to know from Larissa something more about citizens' engagement in improving service delivery, maybe providing examples or cases.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think citizens' engagement is not just in the service delivery, but also just in in the process to get to the service delivery, to ask actually what are the priorities within this municipality. And so what we as GIZ are doing is just to strengthen participatory processes. So for example, by having focus group discussions, including various groups and certain processes, but also through communication and outreach. So trying to actively motivate people to participate and contribute. Maybe one very concrete example, we have now in several municipalities, so I think, well, just some centers open, but we have women development and training centers in, I believe, more than 10 municipalities in Libya now. And so these centers are, initially they were planned to provide training, so occupational possibilities for women by providing training, but then also a place where they can use their skills to be engaged in income generating activities. But these centers are also run by the municipalities, and now they also serve as a great place to have a public dialogue specifically for women, where women can make their voices heard, and where municipalities can organize events to actually get these voices that maybe they wouldn't hear so much otherwise. So that's just one example of how it is done on the ground.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Larissa. I'm going to turn back to Susanna.
Yes, thank you, Larissa. Actually, you partially answered the next question that I was going to ask both you and Frida. The question is, well, it starts with the premise. It is well established that women are often the most adversely affected in conflicts. And now the question, in your experience, how can local governments do more to represent and empower women in peace-building processes and legal reforms for decentralization and local governance? So maybe the focus more strictly on women empowerment. I guess maybe we can start with Frida, since Larissa already gave us some insights.
Thank you very much, Susanna. So for women empowerment, what we have done is having a lot of advocacy. This is where when we're supporting them do the local government laws for each of the states and the decentralization policies, we try and have quotas for women. They have not been successful in all areas. Some of them, like Somaliland, they've been shot down by the cabinet. But in other areas, they've been very successful. For example, when they were forming the district councils in the new federal member states in Southwest states, they were able to get 50% representation of women in the district councils. And this was a lot because of the sensitization that was done before the district council formation happened. And also learning from the mature districts that when they have more women, they are able to get more peace outcomes because they're able to bring more people to the table, including the marginalized, the youth, and people in IDPs. The other thing we do is capacity building, and this mostly is in the form of helping women at the campaign level. So we teach them about campaign tactics, how to finance their campaigns, how to reach the people, how to style their messages, how to be able to negotiate with the elders so that they can be selected for the election. And this is quite a challenge because, again, in Somalia, most of the time, it's the elders that will decide who is to be elected. And they have a case where, for example, if a woman gets married, she is considered to be in the husband's family. But when she goes to the husband's family, they consider an outsider. So it becomes very difficult for women to come into play in such a situation. So that is mostly about trying to sensitize them that they can work, women can work in any community, whether it's the immediate family or where she's married. The other one we've tried to do is having women networks, and we are trying to have mentors within those women networks, especially for the young aspiring candidates in the elections. The other one is having a young graduates program where we get young graduates from the university and we attach them to the ministries and to the districts to be able to learn the ropes on civil service. And we insist on having a 50-50% representation. In one of the states, we've been able to have 70% of females, but in the new federal member states, it's still a touchy issue, even getting to the 30%. The other one we have done is having women-friendly spaces in some of the ministries where we have toilets specifically for women, because when they were sharing with the men, they would actually just work for like 2 hours and then go home. But now they're able to do a full day's work because of that. And in one of the ministries, we've also been able to have a mother-child room. So women who have small children can have them be brought for breastfeeding. Thank you. Sorry, maybe to add one more thing is we do have something called the Champion's Office. In all the vice presidents, in the states, we have the vice president's office. We make them champions of decentralization and local governance, and then they're able to have more of a voice. So a lot of the gender work is also done with the vice president's office, and they're able to bring in a lot of clout and navigate the political state with most of the ministries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Frida, for that. I think you really outlined some very concrete measures that have been taken, which really goes to show that having quotas and having what's written in the law is often not enough. You have to do a lot more sensitization and engagement with society and with all the stakeholders as well. So thanks for that. Larissa, would you like to take a shot at responding to this question as well?
Sure. Yeah, so I've already outlined the work GSED is doing with the Women Development and Training Centers. And I think one example or one lesson learned from this is that oftentimes it's just necessary to give women the space to actually express their opinions and to engage. And I think there's no one-size-fits-all solution here. So in some municipalities and in some countries, this will mean that there needs to be a space just for women, and in others it needs to be something like quotas and integrating them in already existing spaces. So I think it needs to be a mix of approaches, but also it's a learning by doing approach. We have seen that as soon as we've worked on these centers, there was immediately a lot of positive response, a lot of interest to engage. So we've really never had a problem to find participants in our projects or programs there. But I also maybe to look a little bit at a higher governance level. What we as GSZ are also doing is that we work with the elected women councillors. So in each council of Libya, there is at least one woman represented. And so from each municipality is one female elected councillor. And we have supported the network of female elected councillors that by now really is a national network that covers all of Libya, and it brings together these women from the north, from the east, from the west, from the south, with very diverging experiences. And it's quite interesting to see them have a dialogue on national problems. So it's really also, I think what I've said before, that also when it comes to strengthening the role of women, it needs to be done at every level of the support that we give.
Thank you very much. Really important observations there and experience from Libya. I'm going to turn to Susanna. Susanna, are we done or do we have further questions? We still have time.
If we still have time, there will be a further question, which is actually a nice wrap up to the conversation. The question is, can you elaborate on whether decentralization in the 3 country cases is contributing to peace building or widening the country divide and conflicts?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a very thought-provoking question. What does our experience show us so far on what we're seeing? So let me turn back to the 2 panelists again. I see Sundus raising her hand. Sundus, did you wish to speak about Iraq?
Yes, please. Yes, please. If I may, I would like to elaborate in a very short for the 2 raised question about the women engagement, and also for the last question that addressed about the peace and decentralization.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. This is Sundus Abbas. I am from UNDP Iraq country office. Just to share with you that for the women engagement with the decentralization in Iraq, we adopt a mechanism of supporting establishment of Women Affairs Office as a subnational women machinery to be reported directly to the governors, and in order to ensure all the policies, programs are gender mainstream. That is supported by other ministries and also UN agencies. From in the same time, under the project of the social cohesion, we support the establishment and of women peace groups coming from the civil society and women activist background. And within the support of UNDP, we try to bridge the relation between the women empowerment offices and the peace groups, women peace groups, in order to bridge the relation and to try to highlight how they can cooperate with each other in order to ensure women participation, gender equality, and women empowerment. Of course, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy at all, especially for in the new liberated area after the war against ISIL. It wasn't easy. Women engagement, it was very slow and very challenging, but day by day, they start to challenge themselves to elaborate more. For the second question, really, I think it is very interesting, and I would like to share with you about the case in Iraq. There was a huge debate on different level, even on the community level, if decentralization will bring division for the community and for the country. But coming from that country, since 2008 until now, after all these debates, we reached the point, if we are talking about better services and better life for people, we need to move toward decentralization, because it never means that country will be divided, but it brings more responsibility for the local authorities to improve the services for the local communities, and also to give more space for local communities and people who are living in the subnational level to engage in policy making, developing their engagement and their participation in their. So in fact now the country reached the point that it wasn't the right image that we think the decentralization will divide. Now the general attitude, it is we are looking for better services and building more social cohesion and peace in the country. And that was reflected through the presentation from Deputy Minister. Thank you, Mahdi. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sundus. And that, building of better service delivery is a key element where if citizens' needs are met, then that also creates concrete steps towards reducing the issues that can result in conflicts. And that can be a building block for peace down the line. So I think you raised something very important there. Thank you. Let me turn quickly, if I have a minute, to each of the other panelists to answer that rather thought-provoking question on whether decentralization is contributing to peace or is it widening the divide. So just 1 minute, please. Larissa, over to you, and then to Frida.
Thank you. Yes, no, I would like to agree with what has been said before. I really think local governance is rather a key for social cohesion and to bring people closer together. And in our experience in Libya, the conflict has never, well, there's conflict on local level, but the real dividing conflict is very much at the national level, and local governance is something that is really supported from all sides, which is also something that strengthens it. So this is just a very good way to get feedback from the municipalities, from the citizens, and then also include this in the overall peace process.
Thank you, Larissa. So 1 minute, Frida, if you would like to reflect.
Thank you very much. Now, on a more general note, when delivered equitably, social services can strengthen the capacity to manage conflict and stresses and promote peace and sustain development objectives. And this is because people feel more invested when the services are being offered. For example, when the guys at the markets, they have water, they have electricity, they are able to pay their taxes. So they wouldn't want somebody to come and destroy it. On the other hand, when you have contested areas like we have in Somalia between two states and we're supporting the rest of the districts other than the contested areas because we can't, then they keep asking their government, why aren't you bringing the JPLG systems to our area? So that causes quite a bit of conflict. The government has tried to address that in terms of doing the government-led expansion, where they take the systems you have taught them to those people without direct UN intervention, but you will do a bit of the technical support on the backside. In areas also like the federal member states where resources are very scarce, decentralization can cause a lot of conflict because the federal government does not have enough money to give to the state government, or if you have a state government that is very, very powerful and they have resources, then they could be able to destabilize the federal government. So if you look at it from the resources side, it could be both ways. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Frida. So I think we are almost out of time. I would like to just thank everybody, thank especially the panelists for their valuable reflections, and also to note that the webinar will be recorded, and the recording and will be available on decentralization.net for your information, if you would like to listen again or share it. Also, tomorrow will be the last of 4 webinars. It will be focusing on urban governance and social inclusion, also in the MENA region. With that, I would like to thank you very much for listening in today and pass the floor back to Serdar for his closing.